Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, September 4th, 2023, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And for my American listeners, happy Labor Day. And I apologize if this doesn't go up right on time. I'm not sure. I can't see the future, but the editor may be getting it up a day late because of the holiday, so we shall see. I also am only days away, hopefully, fingers crossed, of the PhD being granted. You guys have stuck with me through this entire process. I've finished everything I need to finish. I have filed my dissertation. I defended it, of course, and got everything approved, filed it with the publisher, finished my internship just a few days ago. So everything's done on my end, and I've done all my paperwork. So now it's literally just admin. It's like waiting for everything to be processed because, of course, that's how the world works. So you can't technically call me doctor yet, but hopefully by the next episode that will be the case. I've got a great episode for you today, but before we dive into it, I do want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, the show is and will always be, as long as I'm able to do it, 100% free to download. But of course, it's not cheap to run because I pay an editor and I also pay my incredible assistant, Noelle, to do everything, to book the episodes, to organize everything, procure the books, to do all of the coding and stuff on the back end and make sure that everything's pushed live, that the social media is managed. It's a lot of work, and I would not be able to do it because I've been working full time, obviously as a psychotherapist, doing my internship to finish my PhD in clinical psychology. And then I'll be starting my postdoc quite soon. But I am about to take a nice, well-deserved break. Sorry, I've kind of gone off on a tangent. But what I was saying is that it's been a slow year with ads, as you guys probably know. I'm basically just relying on programmatic ads right now, which pay a lot less than host-read ads. And so ultimately, my shows aren't making money except for the support from listeners just like you. So pledging your support on Patreon is a completely volunteer thing, right? You're basically offsetting the cost so that individuals who can't afford to pay can still get access for free. If you're interested in being one of the many who are supporting the show, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy. And I do want to give a shout out to the top patrons this week. As always, they are Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, and Ulrika Hagman. Now, remember those names because soon I'm going to be banking some episodes. I'm about to travel a bit to celebrate finishing my degree. And so I'm going to be pre-recording the intros for the next several episodes, which means I'm probably not going to be shouting out people's names from Patreon because I'm not sure exactly who will have pledged at that point because I can't see the future. So remember those names. They are my regular patrons. And then once I'm back and recording these intros a little bit closer to the air dates, I will be giving you an update. All right, so let's talk about this week's episode. So I had the opportunity to sit down with Dr. Eugenia Cheng. She's a mathematician, an educator, an author, a public speaker, a writer, and also a concert pianist, composer, and artist. She has the coolest job in the world. She is the scientist in residence at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. She's won a ton of awards. She's written a ton of really brilliant books, and she has a new one out for us today. It's called Is Math Real? How Simple Questions Lead Us to Mathematics' Deepest Truths. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Eugenia Cheng. Well, Eugenia, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So we're going to talk about your newest book today, Is Math Real? How Simple Questions Lead Us to Mathematics' Deepest Truths. But this is, of course, not your first book. You've written so many books about math, and this makes me so very happy because I feel like of the STEM subjects, mathematics is very much the least represented in sort of popular culture. Mm-hmm. I'm curious if you feel the same way.
Yes, I do feel that way. And also in popular culture, certainly in movies and in fiction, it's too often a particular image of math that is portrayed, of someone who's maybe a bit strange, a bit different, not like the rest of us, can't make eye contact, doesn't have friends, but is some kind of weird genius and usually a white guy. And that's one of the reasons I decided I really wanted to put myself out there as an example of someone who I hope isn't like that. And also to just bring a certain kind of math to more people, not just numbers and equations, and not just here's an equation that's going to be really useful to you, although it's not really useful because you're not actually going to need to do it yourself in your real life.
Right. And I think that there is this disconnect. I see this also with engineering and computer science quite often when we think about STEM. Actually, I see it across kind of all STEM subjects, but I feel like it's especially salient across mathematics, computer science, and engineering, where there's this idea of like, well, the smart people can handle that and I'll just utilize the fruits of their labor, as
Yeah.
opposed to like, I need to actually at least understand this just generally, conceptually. It's almost like people don't believe that there is a conceptual way to understand math.
Yeah, and people don't believe that there are parts that can be helpful for them personally, besides, as you say, using the fruits of somebody else's labor. And so I meet plenty of people who appreciate the fact that math has been done by other people, but feel like they don't need it in their daily lives. And I have great sympathy for that, because most of the math that is presented as useful is not things that normal people do in their daily lives. You know, I don't solve differential equations in my daily life. I don't do trigonometry. I don't calculate angles in triangles in my daily life. So I wanted to present a different side of math that is more about using our brains well, because we do use our brains in our daily life. And any way that we can learn to use our brains better is going to help us.
Oh, 100%. You know, it's so funny because mathematics is such a deep field, but so often I think that we equate it with, I don't know, measurement. And measurement is a part of mathematics. And I think it's because that's the type of mathematics that we often use in our daily lives. We cook and we have to measure things. We are hanging art in our homes and we have to measure things and we have to use fractions and we have to divide. But I love the grappling with the core principles of mathematics, like quantities and how quantities represent objects, and some of these really almost philosophical concepts. Would you say that it's sort of on par with philosophy in that way?
Yeah, I would. And especially the branch of math that I tend to talk about, which is abstract math. It gets very close to philosophical, especially because I'm not trying to get people to become research mathematicians. I'm not trying to get them to be able to do the rigorous algebraic logical proofs. I'm trying to get them to appreciate and understand how it works. And when you're thinking about how math works and why it works, that does get kind of philosophical. And so some of the questions that I address in the book are questions that, well, on the one hand, they're questions that tiny children can pose, but actually tiny children can be quite philosophical when they say things like, you know, why? Why is this true? Why do we do this? Where does it come from?
Yeah. You know, I'm curious to learn more about how you got where you are today, because I know that you are a visiting fellow at City University of London, but your kind of, I guess, main gig, other than writing, you've written so many books, is that you're scientist in residence at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, which is probably a paradoxical to most people, thinking, wait, a mathematician is in residence at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. How does that work?
Isn't that cool? I think it's really fantastic. And it was
Yeah.
it came about because people have started getting artists in residence in science institutes. And so there are some physics labs who have who have artists in residence, trying to just bring science to non-scientists through art. And so the School of the Art Institute decided to try it the other way around. And it's all about bridging the gaps and getting rid of the unnecessary boundaries that we so often put in between things. Because science and art sound like they're polar opposites. But where is the line between them? And so I am scientist in residence, which is just about trying to explore the relationships rather than the differences between art and science, and bridging those gaps that don't need to be there.
Yeah. I love that so much. So how did you what did you I mean, I'm assuming that you studied mathematics and that's how you got to where you are, but how did you determine which field and where you wanted to put your emphasis? And have you always been sort of working towards the same goal, or did you kind of switch gears along the way a few times?
I did switch gear, but I worked towards being a mathematician for my whole life. I was always drawn to the most abstract thing that I had ever seen. And so when I was very little, my mother is mathematical. And so I was very fortunate because she showed me cool mathematical ideas at home, not just now we're going to do our times tables in our spare time, but things like concepts, the concept of a graph, the idea that you can turn a logical process into a picture, which just so intrigued me and made my brain feel like it was expanding out of my skull. And so I loved the concept of shapes and the concept of abstraction. And I loved the fact that with math, it seemed to me that I didn't have to just believe some adult who was telling me something, that it felt like there was an explanation to everything that I could understand if I just thought harder or dug deeper. Whereas in other subjects, it seemed to me that I had to just believe people. You know, if someone in physics, it seemed like there were these laws that you just had to believe. Whereas in math, everything had an explanation. And I know that to some people, to many people actually, it doesn't feel like that math seems like it's just a bunch of arbitrary rules that have flown in from outer space. And so that's one of the things that makes me sad, because that's so different from how I experienced math and why I came to love it so much. Because I was that child who just kept asking why all the time and was never really satisfied with an answer. And that is really what the impulse for math is. It's to keep asking why and not be satisfied until the answer gets deeper and deeper, which is why this book is about questions rather than answers, because we keep questioning everything. And so it just drew me like a magnetic force towards the most abstract kind of mathematics, because when I was at school, in high school in England, we choose subjects progressively as we go along. And so when we got to choose just 3 or 4 subjects in the last 2 years, I really wanted to just do math and science. So I did. And then I went to university, and in university in England, you just choose one subject and you study that. You don't kind of do loads of things and then pick a major. I knew I wanted to do math. And then when I got to university, I knew I wanted to do just pure math, which is the kind that is furthest away from daily life, apparently. And then once I started doing just pure math, I just wanted to do algebra. And once I was just doing algebra, I just wanted to do category theory, which is what my research ended up being. And because each of those things is like an explanation of everything else. And then finally, when I got to category theory is an explanation of mathematics in a way. And so I felt like I had found my home at last.
It's so interesting the way that we as human beings, I think, have this pull towards taxonomy and categorization and labeling and bucketing and discriminating. And I think that I could be wrong here, but a sort of common conception is that when we think about different STEM fields, and even like my field, I work in clinical psychology. So it is a science, right? I'm finishing my PhD as we speak. I just defended yesterday, actually.
Wow. Congratulations. That's amazing. That's a huge step.
Thank you so much. And so it's interesting because I think about how clinical psychology is like one of the most applied versions of science that you can get, right? We're actually talking about how do we take these things that we've discovered and really affect change in people's lives with them. But then I feel like very often we think about these different STEM fields categorically, and we think about sort of quote unquote first principles, like what underlies what and what's foundational and and we keep excavating and excavating.
Oh,
and
yeah, excavating. That's a great image.
Right. And very often, I think that we have this idea that mathematics lies sort of at the deepest foundation of almost every science, that until we understand what quantification is, until we understand what categories are, what numbers are, and how they work, and how we label things, it's hard for us to do physics or biology or chemistry or even psychology. Yet, very often, we pretend, as you mentioned before, like these foundational principles are not fundamental things to grapple with. They're things we should just, I don't know, accept as given.
Yeah, I think it's really complicated and subtle, actually, because there are a lot of things that we can accept as given and we can get by perfectly fine. And so, for example, I accept gravity as given. I do not pretend to understand gravity, but I'm pretty sure that I just go around making use of gravity all the time because what choice do I have? It's just there. And so there are things like that in math as well, that we can use numbers even though we don't really know what numbers are. If you ask most people, what are numbers? Well, maybe they've never thought about it. And then some people, it has really bothered them what numbers are. And that's why they get put off math, because no one ever really explained to them what a number is. And so there's this weird conundrum where you can just kind of, if you just kind of accept what numbers that do, then you can get on perfectly fine. And if you get all tangled up worrying about what numbers are, then it seems like you are bad at math, when what you're really doing is thinking much more deeply about where things come from. And mathematicians think really deeply about where those things come from. It's just that in the normal education system, you can kind of be really successful in your standardized tests without thinking deeply about where they come from.
It's so sad, really, because it's the opposite of what the assumption becomes. It's the opposite of the shame that we start to carry. Like, I'm super curious and I am not willing to take because I said so as an answer. And therefore, I feel like I'm not good at math. And of course, there are all of these, gender problems here too, with like stereotype threat and the way that we're taught. But it's, I try to parallel it maybe for individuals for whom thinking about math makes them a little bit twitchy. So of course, like we want to ease into this. I think about maybe the way that we're often taught medicine as well in our country, that there's just certain things because there's just too much to know that you have to just accept. This is how the liver works. This is how the kidney works. Accept it so that now we can grapple with what happens when something goes wrong. But there are also the individuals who are like, no, but why? How did it come to be that way? And what happens when the pressure is just a little bit off here? And what happens when there's this anomaly during development that causes this to change? And I think that very often, almost every STEM field can be deconstructed in that way. And you are always going to find the individuals who are fundamentally interested in why the things happen the way they happen. And then you're going to find the individuals who are like, I'm going to take all of that as truth so that I can work on this other problem that requires that I don't grapple with those things for too long.
And it's important that we do both. If we go too far into either extreme, then we'll get stuck. So if we just think about why the whole time, then we never get anywhere. Like when toddlers just keep saying why to put off bedtime or to avoid having to put their shoes on to go out. Whereas if we never ask why, then we don't get into the deep understanding and then we can't develop. And so I'm not saying that we should only ever ask why. And actually, one thing that is important in math is to be able to accept things without really understanding them and keep going anyway. It's both of those things. It's just that I think that the emphasis in normal math education is way too far the other way. And it's way too much about accepting because I said so as a truth. And it's often because the explanation is quite hard. And so this is one of the wonderful and terrifying things about teaching math to small children, is that a tiny child can ask a question that is exceedingly difficult to answer and requires a huge amount of research math. So if you don't know that research math, then it can seem terrifying. And even if you do, how do you then explain that to a 4-year-old? I think it's amazing that that can happen. It's kind of like the fact that you can explain the rules of chess to a child, but then there are grandmasters who are still grappling with quite how to win and what strategies to have. I think that's an amazing, amazing thing.
Yeah. And I mean, I can imagine that there are individuals listening right now who are thinking to themselves, how could you possibly be grappling with abstract math? Like, hasn't everything just been figured out? Like there's
sometimes
probably people who are like, didn't we already
come up with a new number?
Right. And so how do you answer people who ask those kinds of questions?
Well, in abstract math, we're understanding concepts and relationships between things. And so whenever you find a new relationship between things, then that becomes a new thing. So this is the wonderful thing about abstract math as opposed to some other things, where when you can kind of just come up with new mathematical objects by having ideas. So if you study birds, for example, you can't just sort of invent a new bird and then that's a bird. You have to find an actual bird. If you find an actual new bird, then you've got a new thing to study. But you can't just sort of invent one in your head and then study it. Whereas with abstract math, the ideas that you come up with are new math. That is part of math. And so we are constantly having new things to study, because every time we come up with an idea, that's a new thing. And then we often have to come up with an idea for how to study that. So if we start with numbers, for example, as the basic starting point for math, then we come up with ways to study numbers. And we say, oh, well, what are numbers? Well, what do they do? Let's call this world something. And then we look at other worlds and go, actually, we can study shapes a bit like the way we study numbers. And if we look at what shapes and numbers have in common, then that is a new mathematical concept. And then we take that mathematical concept and see where else we can find examples of it going on. And then we gradually realize we can study more and more things a bit like numbers. So then we study shapes, and then we study spaces, and then we study relationships between ideas, and then we study relationships between those. And it may sound extremely piled up on itself, but that's kind of the point. And so it's kind of like, I always like to think it's like those vacuum cleaner bags where you put all your clothes in a bag and then you suck the air out and it becomes one thing. You can fit it in more. And so a lot of abstract math is about packaging up concepts so that they become one unit as a package, so that our brain can then deal with it more easily, because our brains get exhausted. Well, mine does anyway. Our brains get so tired because they're so small and finite. If we can take a bunch of things, package them up so that they become one thing, then we can carry it around in our brain better. And then we can take a bunch of those packages and package them up into one thing. And then we keep going. And that's a way to, if not exactly become more intelligent, become more effective at using our brains.
You know, there's something that you touched on there, which I think is like an important sort of fundamental thing to grapple with here. I keep mentioning STEM, and that's because we have decided as a culture that we're going to package science, technology, engineering, and math into one thing. And we think about science, and science can be applied, but it can also be sort of more kind of fundamental science. We think about technology and engineering. And I see a firm distinction in some respects between science and then technology and engineering. Like science is the investigation and very often the interrogation of the natural world. So things are, and we are messing with them to try and figure out how and why they are. And then engineering and technology is how can we take that knowledge and then make new stuff. Now, when I think about mathematics, I am still very confused, because the question is there just a way things are and we're discovering it? Or are we generative? Are we creating the things that we are utilizing in real time in an effort to then make more sense of the way that things are? Like, it's a complicated, talk to me about this. Yeah. Is it one or the other or both? Is mathematics an explanatory system, or is it a generative system?
I think it's both. I think almost everything is both. And there are so many times when we try and put things in opposition with each other, when really I prefer to go, well, what's the sense in which it's this and what's the sense in which it's that? And I think math is both, in the following sense, that we look at the world around us and we try and understand how it works. And so we see something going on in the world around us. That's already happening. And so when we look at numbers, for example, numbers come from seeing patterns in objects. So we take one banana and another banana, and then we take one apple and another apple, and we take one pear and another pear, and we see a pattern that's happening across those objects that if we kind of if we blur our vision a little bit and forget the banana hood of the bananas and the apple hood and so on, then those situations have become at some level the same. But then the part that we invent is a way of talking about it. So we see that pattern that exists, and then we come up with a way of thinking about it. So we call it numbers. And then once we've come up with this system of numbers, we say, okay, I'm going to have a number 1. And then when I have 1 and another 1, that's going to be called 2. And when I have another one, that's going to be called 3. And then once we've done that, we can then explore this system that we have come up with. So we kind of set a system off, but we decide that it's going to grow by logic. It's kind of like planting a seed, right? If you plant a seed in the garden, you planted it, but then nature takes over and it grows into something. And so I think it's like that. It's like starting the rules of a game, and then you let the game go and see what happens. And once you've let it go and see what happens, then you start studying just stuff that is happening anyway. And then it happens again, because then you invent ways to talk about that. So we start numbers off by taking one and another one and another one. And then we have the concept of addition. And then we can go, oh, if I add the same thing a bunch of times, I can call that multiplication. And then you have a concept of multiplication. And then you can go, oh, I'm going to explore multiplication. But multiplication is just happening now. You came up with a way of talking about it, but now it's a concept that has its own life. And it's like a creature that is wandering around in the wilderness. Now you can study its behavior and come up with a way of thinking about its behavior.
I think about, obviously, I keep coming back to my psychologist frame, and I think about how, like, psychology as a discipline would not exist without people. It's the study of how our minds work and how we, interact with one another. And so it's very, very dependent on human experience and human behavior, phenomenology.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe you can look at another extreme. We can talk about, let's say, cosmology, and say that in some respects, obviously, cosmology would exist with no observer. And in other respects, our observation of cosmology is actually how we define our cosmology. Like when we start to get into entanglement and we start to get into Schrodinger and like all of these interesting concepts. And I'm curious, when we think about mathematics, is it more like, I don't know, often you'll hear people talk about language and kind of equate it to language, but that's not a perfect analogy, is it?
No, no analogy is perfect, is it? Because then it wouldn't be an analogy.
Right.
So I think I really like the comparison with psychology and cosmology, because with psychology, I imagine, and you're the expert here, but I imagine that what happens is you study humans' behavior and then you come up with a theory for understanding that behavior. And so there is still also the observation and the generative part there. It's just that the behavior and the framework you come up with for studying it are separate things. And the same with cosmology. You look at, say, planets, and then you come up with a framework for studying those planets. But the framework that you come up with is not a planet. It's a framework for studying planets. And the thing that's different about abstract math is that when you come up with a framework for studying some abstract math, that framework is itself a piece of abstract math. And so that's why it becomes much more looped up on itself.
I think in some ways it's similar to psychology in that way, because you're right. Like we are the framework versus the actual kind of phenomenon that we're studying are distinct, yet weirdly, it is the human brain that is studying itself. Yes. And so the thoughts that we are inventing are in and of themselves thoughts, and they actually do change. There's a lot of good evidence to show that the way that we think about how we think then changes how we think.
Yeah. And I think this is really fascinating for abstract mathematics as well, because as an abstract mathematician, the only tool we have is our brain. And so we're not using complicated lab equipment. We don't have to build machines. We don't have to get grants to get equipment. We just have to understand how our own brain works. And so we sort of have to be a psychologist on ourselves to get our brains to work better, because it's the only tool we have. So if you work with cars or computers, you need to understand how they work to get them to work better. We have to, for abstract mathematics, we have to do that on our brain because it's the only thing that we've got.
I can't help but feel like, when you look at sort of like the political spectrum, and if you go so far to the left, you kind of come back round to the right and vice versa. I feel like that's the case when we're thinking about these two disciplines that are so wildly different. And we think of them as being like one being super fundamental and the other being so applied. But ultimately, they're sort of turning back in on themselves the deeper we get into them. And I love that. I feel in some ways very connected to this field that growing up, I have to admit, and this is obviously another conversation that is one that I know that you care passionately about, but I have to admit, I had the same experience as so many young girls where it felt hard, it felt unnatural. I saw in my peers that there was a confidence and that the boys in the classroom were like, no, but it's easy. And so I thought, well, then I must not be very smart or I must not be good at this, and shied away from it.
Yeah, it's such a shame. And that's one of the reasons I write the books I do, and particularly this one, because I think actually the people who think that they're not good at it often have better mathematical instincts. I don't want to say better, but more like research mathematicians, because research mathematicians don't usually think things are obvious. They usually think that things are very difficult and confusing because we're seeking such a deep understanding of things. And so some people will go, oh, 1+1 is obviously 2, idiot. And then they're the ones who get called good at math. And then somehow the people who think they're bad at math and the research mathematicians have the same response, which is actually 1+1 might not always be 2. Why do we think 1+1 is 2? Let's explore different situations in which 1+1 isn't 2. And then maybe we can understand better why it so often is by also understanding when it isn't. And then that sends us off into some deep research math that we would never see if we just sat there going, oh, 1+1 is obviously 2.
Yeah, I think about this is such a prime example, I think about the fact that when I was a kid, I never learned my multiplication tables.
Yes.
It was just daunting. I was like,
Yeah.
I cannot memorize all those numbers in a grid for no reason. I don't understand how they're connected.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So instead I realized once I got to, let's say 3 times 4 or 3 times 5, I could just double the numbers and get the same result. I figured out the method between them as opposed to just knowing it. And I know that screwed me in life for fast tabulations. I am not a fast calculator. I know this about myself, but at least I understand, I think to some extent, why those numbers become, when you multiply them, become what they are, as opposed to just taking that for granted.
Exactly. And here's the thing. Research mathematicians I know also didn't memorize their times tables. I didn't memorize my times tables. I'm perfectly fine at my times tables, as you say, by seeing patterns and understanding relationships between numbers. I'm better than average at my times tables, but I'm definitely not one of those people who can just multiply large numbers in my head just like that. And the thing is, what is that even useful for? You say you're not a calculator and you're not a fast tabulator. We have computers now.
Yeah, I have a calculator on my phone.
Exactly. It's not even a useful skill. It's like the fact that at some point in the past, horse riding was a really important skill. Not so much anymore, which isn't to say it's useless. And it's also, for some people, it's really fun if they happen to have access to those things. And so it's not to say nobody should do it. If you enjoy doing it, it's fun. Some people really love memorizing their times tables. Fine. But not if that stops them from understanding some relationships between numbers. And also not if it intimidates other people into thinking that they're bad at math because they're not fast at their times tables. I just don't think it's a very relevant skill. I get into trouble for saying this because for some reason there are still people who really cling to the idea that memorizing times tables is important. And so what I say is this: if you can do it and it helps you, then great. But we shouldn't force people to do it to the extent that they just end up hating math. And I meet so many people, many of my students, who tell me that's what finished them off. And so what are we achieving by trying to get people to memorize their times tables? What we're achieving is a lot of math phobia. And I think that that's a really bad outcome.
Well, and not just math phobia, but I think in some ways an even more kind of sinister issue, which is shame. We're really inducing a lot of shame in our culture. And it's fascinating that, I think of 2 very specific examples. I am somebody who is literally days away from being Dr. Santa Maria. You are Dr. Cheng. So when I say to the world, to whoever's listening to this podcast, that number 1, when I multiply by 9, I still do that trick on my fingers.
Mm-hmm.
And number 2, when I have to alphabetize things, I still have to sing the damn song in my head.
Oh.
And both of those things are hacks that have helped me get through life, that saved up important processing space in my brain for other stuff. And I'm not ashamed of that, and I'm not embarrassed by it. But I would venture to guess that if you were to survey, a bunch of college students on a campus and say, is this how you calculate by 9, or is this how you alphabetize? They would start laughing and hide their face if that's how they still did it, and be like, oh my gosh, I'm so embarrassed. Yes. Why are we embarrassed by that?
We're embarrassed because people have humiliated us for it. People who get their self-esteem from being able to do things that other people can't do laugh at other people when they can't do something because it makes them feel better about themselves. And so I think at a deeper root, I wish we could educate people not just to be able to do things and know things, but to be nicer humans and to get their self-esteem not from being better at something than someone else, but from how much they are able to help somebody else do something. And that's where I get my self-esteem from. I get it from being able to help someone else understand some difficult piece of mathematics that they previously couldn't understand. And my favorite thing is if they go, oh, or they get excited about something that they used to be afraid of. That is what makes me feel good. Bringing more people into something, because if people get their self-esteem from being able to do something that other people can't, then it gives them an incentive to keep people out of things. And I think that's one of the big problems around mathematics and the way that people have been humiliated, because it has been often, I think, a deliberate act by somebody who wants to keep people out in order for them to still feel that their self-esteem is intact.
And I think it very, very readily maps back to a sort of colonialist, white supremacist, male supremacist ideal and ethic. And what you end up with, sadly, as you've been mentioning, is this sort of exclusionary practice that does not celebrate helping or collaboration and actually perpetuates this very dangerous myth of sort of like the lone genius, who is always a white dude, by the way. That like the most important things that have happened in the world. And we still see it to this day. I mean, don't get me wrong. I recently went and saw Oppenheimer. I did the whole Barbieheimer thing and was obsessed, honestly, with both. I think they were both phenomenal films. But one thing I didn't like about Oppenheimer, which we see over and over and over, and I get it, it's a shorthand for films, is that it's like, oh, he was the guy. No, there was a lot of people involved. And I think that's, why do we do this? Why do we obsess over one character? It just, it all reinforces this very, very dangerous narrative.
Yeah, it's like the idea of a self-made billionaire.
Right, exactly.
Just in isolation. And I say to myself, you can't be self-made unless you went off into the forest off grid and no contact with the rest of society.
It's so true. And it's like, it's so sad how much, obviously this is again coming from the psychologist over here, but this idea that I've grappled with quite a lot. And there was an episode I did, now it's been months and months and months, with Brian Lowry about the self and the creation of self, and how the concept of self literally cannot exist without intersubjectivity. We cannot be us without the way that we enact with others. And I think that the way that we teach these things maps back to that in such a, I don't know, insidious way. We teach them as lone and isolated endeavors, and it reinforces a lot of shame, especially in young women.
Yeah. And I think it is very tied up with how we rank people all the time in the education system, that we're constantly trying to put people into hierarchies and give them scores and say who's better than who. Because if you're trying to rise up in that hierarchy, one way to do it is to keep other people down, because that's one way that you can rise up. And so it gets very deeply embedded in everybody's behavior, because if you're celebrated for getting more points than somebody else, then that becomes part of what you aim to do. And then you develop self-esteem around getting more points than everyone else.
Agree. It's like, in a way, like the sort of capitalist system that's overlaid on us, it requires it, right? Because there's only so much funding, or there is a zero-sum game when it comes to economics. But the currency, quote unquote, of creativity, of generativity, whether it be curiosity or intelligence or creativity, that's not a zero-sum game.
Yes, exactly. And I wrote about this in one of my previous books, X plus Y, a mathematician's manifesto for rethinking gender, and about how we so often fabricate zero-sum games that don't need to be there. And as you say, yes, if there's limited funding, then there is a zero-sum game. But in education, what we're talking about is knowledge and understanding, and that is not a zero-sum game. Actually, I think it's the opposite, that if you give understanding to somebody else, you will increase your own understanding at the same time. And so you actually increase the total amount of understanding there is. And I think that is a beautiful thing. And there aren't many things that do that. I think love is another one, actually, that if you give love, then you get more love. And I think,
and also you induce sort of this positive feedback loop wherein love starts to be, or creativity, generativity, whatever, intelligence, knowledge, it starts to be spread around. Like, if it's not just that you sort of get it back as you give it, like, it's true. If you want to know something, teach it, like, because you did not know it until you've taught it.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, ooh, man, do you learn a lot. But
Oh, yeah.
then also the students in class, they have their different sparks, right? Oh my God, I get it. Oh my God, I get it. And this other kid in the corner is like, no, but I don't get it. And they're like, let me show you how I got
Yeah,
it. And it spreads around in such a beautiful way.
yeah. And I think that is too often missing. And I don't blame teachers at all. It's really the system that pits people against each other all the time, because it pits students against each other. It pits schools against each other. It's always about ranking, and then teachers get ranked according to how their students do in their tests. And it's really destructive, I think. But I agree with you that it's kind of a system of capitalism that's laid on top of our education system.
I'm really interested in this idea of, because I think that teaching at the kind of primary and secondary levels is in and of itself like a fascinating science and art. And the educators at those levels are trained in education. They're trained in pedagogy. They're trained in psychology. But when you get to the kind of quote unquote elite, the university level, the doctoral level, you're no longer dealing with individuals who are taught how to teach. And sometimes I worry that at least at sort of the basic college level, we're failing our students because we have this mentality, not always, but in some specific cases, this mentality of like gatekeeping of knowledge, kind of like, I am the expert and I know things and I shall share them with you so that you then know them, as opposed to, I want us all in this room to be curious experts. I want us all to be sharing ideas. And I, as the professor, am not threatened when a student challenges me in a way I've not been challenged. That excites me and makes me want to collaborate with them. I feel like we don't see that enough.
Yeah, and I think it's tricky though, because when students are encouraged to challenge professors just for the sake of challenging them, that isn't necessarily productive.
Right, that's true.
And I think that's why that there's a vicious cycle that can happen when students feel that they're trying to get one up on a teacher by asking them a question that's going to catch them out. And then teachers aren't going to feel encouraged to respond wholeheartedly to the questions because they feel that the student is trying to make them feel stupid. And I've certainly seen students, usually male students, who are trying to catch someone out, usually a female professor or a person of color. And so if we need to get rid of that idea earlier in the system as well. And I think that there's a kind of opposite problem, which is that when elementary school teachers have to teach everything, if they're not comfortable with math themselves, then they may feel very uncomfortable if a child asks them a question that they don't know how to answer. And they may feel like they're going to look stupid if they don't know how to answer it. Whereas instead, if we could create a society that values that and then says, that's wonderful if a child can ask a question that a teacher can't answer, we can figure out how to answer it together. How can we now we can learn about how knowledge is uncovered. And that's a much more valuable transferable lesson than just the knowledge itself. How we decide that things are true. Gosh, wouldn't that be an important thing for everybody to be better at?
Gosh, I remember just recently I was traveling in Southern Africa in the small country of Eswatini, formerly Swaziland, with a group of psychology students, and we were tasked with going into these very poor high schools and actually sometimes elementary schools as well. And we would each kind of take a classroom and we would have deep conversations with them about psychology and about some of the issues that they were facing in their lives. So, sex and HIV is a big problem, and relationships and things of that nature, and abuse. And I remember as I was talking to some of the students as we were getting ready to go into the classrooms, a lot of them were like, oh, I'm really nervous. What if they think I'm dumb? What if they think I don't know anything? And I was like, if they ask you a question you don't know the answer to, that's awesome. Like, don't tap dance. Say, I don't know the answer to that. Let's figure it out together. And for me, it's so interesting. It must be like some combination of the way that my mother raised me and some of the amazing sort of teachers that I was lucky enough to be exposed to. I don't know what it is, but I naturally it's probably not naturally, honestly. I was probably taught to go towards the unknown and to go towards the gray and to celebrate in that and to not feel shame about it. But so often I see this example like over and over and over of I'm not allowed to be wrong. I'm not allowed to not know things. And I mean, we see it in our government, obviously. We see it in our political structure. It's so detrimental.
Yes. And it is a vicious cycle, because if we attack people or ridicule them for not knowing something, then they're not going to feel like they can admit that they don't know something. And when I first started teaching, I was so fresh out of my PhD, so fresh, I hadn't actually submitted it yet. And I was teaching master's students at the University of Cambridge, and I was so little beyond their level. I was absolutely terrified that they were going to just try to destroy me, especially because on the list of professors, I think I might have been the only one who wasn't doctor, and then that also drew attention to the fact that I was female, because I had to have a title that indicated my gender, whereas when you're doctor, it's all not drawing attention to your gender. And so I was just really worried that if someone asked me a question I didn't know how to answer, then they would go, oh, why you are a professor? You don't deserve to be a professor. You don't know anything. Whereas now, first of all, I'm much older and I'm teaching art students, and they are not expert mathematicians. And so I'm so comfortable. If they ask me something that I don't know, then I can celebrate it, because I think that's a wonderful thing. And I wish that everyone teaching could be in that position. And I'm not blaming them at all. I think that it really does come from the treatment they've had from other people. It's a bit like a form of imposter syndrome. And I don't think we should call imposter syndrome. I think we should call it surrounded by horrible people syndrome.
Yeah, exactly. Gaslighted. Yeah, completely. Oh, I agree. You know, it's so funny because my experience was similar, but in some ways opposite. Like I did an undergrad in psych, and then my first master's ended up being in neuroscience, basically. So, but it was in the biology department. So I had to sort of start over. And before I dove into my master's, I took a bunch of sort of level the playing field courses. And I remember I literally took Biology 101 in the summer, and then I taught it in the fall. Oh. And it was such a bizarre experience of like, it was really fresh in my mind, which was great. I had just grappled with it, but it was this really random experience where almost I couldn't fake it. It would have been too ludicrous. So I had to just own the fact that I was really green and that we were going to figure this out together. And I think in doing that, I made a decision that was pretty fateful for the rest of my life, because now that's just how I approach most everything. Is like, I maybe know a little more than you do. I maybe have been privileged enough to have slightly more experiences, but ultimately we're figuring this out together.
Mm-hmm. And did anyone, I mean, I think that's fantastic that you did that. And it sounds wonderful. I bet it was a great class. Did anyone attack you for it? Did any students attack you for it?
Oh, 100%.
Oh, wow.
And this is something that maybe I've just developed because I've been doing psychom for so long. And you, of course, have probably a very similar experience on social media, on, having these public kind of appearances. You have to learn sort of what to take personally and what to not. And it's like so much easier said than done. I always say to myself, like, am I having a mental health day where I can read the comments? No? Okay, then I'm not reading the comments. Yes? Okay, then I'm going to grapple with the comments, because there's always going to be terrible people trying to feel better about themselves by making you feel bad about yourself. But I think I was also in some ways lucky. I mean, this is neither here nor there, but I was very, very young. I got my undergrad when I was 20. And so when I started teaching at the master's level, I was only 21 years old. But I was given a group or multiple classes of what they called TAM students, the Texas Academy of Math and Science. I went to college in Texas where I grew up. And that is this amazing opportunity for high school students to attend university. And they have their own prom and they stay in their own special dorm. And it's mapped to high school. So freshmen in high school are freshmen in college, all the way up to seniors. So I got to teach these young kids who were also trying to figure out who they were in the world and grapple with identity. And it was so cool because they saw me as sort of like, okay, you're just a few years ahead of me. And like, you're figuring it out. I can figure it out too. And I loved that. I never want to be the mother. I always want to be the big sister. Like, to me, that's a better role.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds like sounds like an amazing system and an amazing experience for everybody.
Right. And unfortunately, it's not the case that that is usually the experience. And it's really unfortunate that very often, I think young professors, young adjuncts, young instructors, lecturers, or just young scientists, if they're lucky enough to have an incredible mentor, oh my gosh, it is world changing. But if they're not and they feel isolated and lonely and like they're figuring it out on their own and that there's nobody there to support them, it's so difficult. And I think you see this so often with especially young women or young individuals of color or young LGBTQI individuals in fields that are generally dominated by like straight, white,
Yeah.
hetero
Mm-hmm.
men, cis
Right.
men.
Right. And I think that I was very lucky because I had amazing mentors. And I was also very lucky because my education and upbringing made me feel that I didn't I didn't need mentors who looked like me, which is just as well because there weren't any. And so there were really zero female math professors doing pure math when I was an undergraduate. And I have never in my whole life had a female Asian professor or teacher. I've never even been to a talk or presentation by a female Asian mathematician. And so although Asians are considered to be overrepresented in mathematics and they don't suffer the same kind of stereotype as other minorities, I still haven't ever seen anyone who looks like me really in a position of authority or responsibility or seniority in my field. But lucky for me, I was brought up to believe I could do anything that anyone else could do. And so I was okay with having white men as my role models because to me, I could do anything they could do. And so that's fine. But I do understand that other people are not brought up to believe that. And they're even told specifically that they can't. Oh, this isn't for you. Oh, this is a man's field. And that's why I decided I'd better put myself out there as a role model. I wish we didn't need female role models and non-white role models. Because in utopia, everyone knows that everyone can do everything. And so we don't need that. But
Right, because we're all just the same species, but
yes,
for some
exactly.
reason we've got all
Right.
these cultural,
Right. We're not,
divisions.
for some reason, we're not in utopia.
Exactly. And it's so sad to see over and over and over the children who are kind of told, well, that's not for you. And sadly, in some ways, they're being told, like, yes, they're being, shot out in the shins, but they're also being told the reality of the world they're coming up in.
Yes,
it's not like they're being told you can't do this by somebody who's just an asshole who wants to be an asshole. They're being told you can't do this because in some ways they're trying to be protected. Like, don't stick your neck out because you're going to get hurt.
Right. But I think we need to separate that part out from the are you biologically predetermined to be unable to do that? And it can come out sounding like that when it's not. It really
when it's that the system is stacked against you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. You're going to have to be that much better at it. Like, you cannot be mediocre and thrive in the system. That's the sad reality of young Black men and women, of young women, of young, of Indigenous individuals. Like, you cannot be mediocre and expect to like rise to the middle, because you won't. You have to be so much better. And that's the only way you will be seen as mediocre. And that is depressing.
It is depressing, but I try to be galvanized rather than depressed and go, well, here are some things we need to do. This is why I do the work I do. This is why it's important to talk about it. And this is why I write books, to try and bring more people in, because I had family who could talk to me about these things and who could introduce interesting mathematical concepts to me. And I know that most people don't have people like that in their family. And that's why I decided to be that surrogate family member with books and articles and podcasts and interviews to try and reach people who otherwise don't have that in their family. And the thing is that it can look like it's biologically determined because people with mathematical parents are often much more comfortable with math. But it's not because of biology. It's just because of the environment and because someone was talking to them about it. And so that is something that I feel I can do. I can't change the whole system at once. I can't wave a magic wand and make us in utopia. But I can try and provide more resources and more explanations to show people the kind of math that I love and that I think is more accessible than it appears.
Oh, I love that. So I'm curious because we're sort of low on time. I can't keep you all day, even though I would love to. I'm curious, especially with this book, but really just with all of the incredible work that you do. Before we close out with the two questions that I ask everybody, I'd just love to know: is there anything specific about abstract math? Is there anything specific about sort of the takeaway of the book that we haven't tapped into that you would want to make sure that we sort of grapple with?
I want to make sure we've stressed the fact that math is not just about answering questions, it's about asking questions. And that while normal school math can seem like to be good at it, you have to answer the questions as fast as possible. Actually, in higher level math, to be good at it, you have to ask really interesting questions. And it's not how fast you answer them, it's how long you spend thinking about them. So actually, answering them quickly doesn't mean you're good. It might mean that you're missing some deeper understanding.
Yeah, I'm just really curious. This came up for me, and I am not an expert and I'm not a parent. So all I know is sort of the chatter that I hear outside. But do you think that the movement towards Common Core in this country is moving in the right direction, the wrong direction, or is this way too complicated a question to answer quickly?
I think it's probably too complicated to answer.
Yeah.
I think that what we need to do is give, broadly speaking, give way more respect to teachers, especially at the elementary level, because they're on the front line of education. That's the first education that children have. And instead of celebrating the people further up and kind of denigrating the elementary school teachers as being basic, the elementary school teachers are the most important. And I think that they should be given more support, more pay, more training, more everything. And then that will help many things. And that's way more important than quibbling about exactly what math we teach and how we teach it.
Love it. All right. So I close my episodes by asking my guests the same two questions every time, and always super curious as to how they're going to answer, especially based on their, personal trajectories. So, I'm very excited to ask a mathematician these questions. So, I want you to think about the future in whatever context feels relevant to you. So, this could be personal, it could be professional, it could be political, it could be communal, social, global, it could be cosmic. The first thing I'm curious about is when you think about the future, what is the thing that's keeping you up the most at night, the thing that you're most concerned about? Maybe you're even kind of dancing a bit with pessimism or even cynicism. And then on the flip side of that, to end on a more kind of positive note, where are you finding your hope and your optimism? What are you really genuinely looking forward to?
So the thing that really worries me is that I think that the whole of society is about to collapse. And whether it's by war that might turn nuclear, climate change that's going to destroy us, or by democracy collapsing, I'm not sure which one is going to happen first. And some of them I can't do very much about, but the democracy collapsing part is the one I feel I can contribute something to the most by education and by trying to get arguments to be less polarized, because what worries me is just how much more polarized everything seems to get every day, instead of people trying to understand each other, even people they vehemently disagree with. And for me, what I've found surprisingly is that the discipline of abstract mathematics helps me to understand people I vehemently disagree with. And so I can always understand them, because the discipline of abstract mathematics, first of all, helps me find analogies between what I'm thinking and what they're thinking, even if it's not the same. Like you say, it's not a perfect analogy, because then it wouldn't be an analogy. But it's an abstract structure in my head that is the same as an abstract structure in their head. And it's a discipline that helps me unpack their argument according to their logic, so that I can understand it from their point of view instead of from my point of view. And that is something that I hope to contribute to, and that I think is a really important application of abstract mathematics that doesn't sound like it is one, because it's not solving an equation or calculating an answer. It's about understanding people we vehemently disagree with. So that's what makes me pessimistic and think that the world is about to end. And what makes me optimistic is young people and the fact that they are declining to put up with the bad things that some of the older generations felt like we just had to put up with. And sometimes it can cause generational divides where older generations go, oh, they're so ungrateful, blah, blah, blah. But I think it's amazing that they won't put up with things. And for a specific example, it makes me so excited to see young female math people, like grad students, speak up about the sexism that they faced. I would never have dreamt of saying that when I was a grad student because I felt so insecure in my position and I didn't want to draw attention to myself. It gives me so much hope that they are speaking up and that they won't put up with those things. And so it gives me hope that they will be able to keep making the world better. There are all sorts of things that we older generations didn't do very well. We did our best under the circumstances, maybe we didn't. But that the thing that gives me hope is that the younger people are finding ways to speak up for themselves more.
Hear, hear. Well, everybody, the book is Math Real? How Simple Questions Lead Us to Mathematics' Deepest Truths by Dr. Eugenia Cheng. Eugenia, thank you so much for spending time with us today. I've learned so much.
Thank you so much. So have I. Thank you.
And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk movie.